And our moderator, Holly Fermini de Jesus, is a principal at Lighthouse Public Affairs, a Housing Action Coalition member, who has worked for more than 20 years at the local, state, and federal levels of government on a variety of policy issues, including and especially housing and local government financing. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Holly.
Thank you, Todd and Michael, for intros, and thank you, Assemblymember Grayson. This is actually a great honor to be asked to moderate, and I miss the conversations in the Capitol and sitting across the conference table with you. And I reiterate what Michael and Todd have said. You are so nice to everybody in every meeting that you're ever in. But I always ask folks when they leave the room, did he actually say yes or no? Because they always feel like they had a great meeting and a positive meeting. And I'm always advising people, make sure you ask him, is he a yes or is he a no? Because you are so nice, you're so genuine, you're so empathetic to whatever issue it is and whoever is in your office. And even just recently, so again, I appreciate you and your style of legislating, and I really, it's just an honor to call you a friend, and you've got wonderful staff, and we've had a lot of fun together. So I think that's why I again appreciate that Michael and Todd thought of me to moderate this discussion, and I hope it's as fun for you all as I'm hoping it will be for me. So recently, I would just kind of like start with, I was recently on a federal panel with a few other lobbyists in other states, and one of the first questions they asked me was like, so what are you working on in California? Like, what are the big initiatives and campaigns in housing? And my response was like, what aren't we working on in California? Like, I mean, it feels like I'm now on this for like 10 years in housing, and like the crisis, I've at some point, some people always ask me, Holly, are we still in a crisis, or is this pretty much now just the norm? Like, at what point in time is the crisis on or off? Because we were in a crisis when the market crashed, a foreclosure crisis. Now we're in another crisis. So I look to you, Assemblymember, before we start diving into the kind of the weeds on the great work that you're doing. I do consider you a fearless leader on housing, even folks that don't realize that because you're not always in the headlines. I think all of us, when we say the word champion, I also say fearless, because you have taken on some things that are really challenging that other people don't realize, that seem like common sense, like impact fees. It's not so common sense in our world in the Capitol, right? What we've gone through. People don't see the behind the scenes.
There are so many dynamics that there's constantly something becoming a pressure point to our greatest need, and that's housing. I do think that I have been afforded a most unique perspective. And the reason why I say that, Holly, is because I currently am still an active general contractor. My license is still active. I don't have any jobs currently lined up, but I have stood on both sides of the counter. On one side, trying to pull a permit to build housing. On the other side, as a council member and a mayor of the largest city in Contra Costa County. And so it brings a very unique perspective. And I know that many of you have already heard the solution to our housing crisis that we have kind of taken on the form of the 3 Ps, and that is production, protection, and preservation. So I believe that this is the right approach. And obviously, as you said, before we dive into the weeds a little bit about what I'm doing, that's been my approach. And I think you all helped give me that direction. You helped provide that definition and that path forward on how to approach our housing crisis here in California, was through those 3 Ps: production, protection, and preservation. So thank you.
Well, and the 3 Ps, I think with no question, 1 P, the tenant protection issue, which you were a part of, authored bills, co-authored bills, and even before the pandemic, that was an area where there was, it took a long time to gain consensus, but even I think some people were shocked and amazed to see the apartment association go neutral. The realtors at one point are neutral in support and opposition. But that 1 P, somehow, some way, some of the dynamics that have been existing for 20 years, there was a breakthrough before the pandemic to get some monumental legislation that even you carried, and again, co-authored, that helped do that. But the production side of the aisle still continues to be the 1 P that feels like the biggest P, that there's still some political dynamics that I don't even know if the word is the right word, is thorny or prickly or or what. But as a member, you're not on housing committee, you're not on local government committee, but your name constantly is up and in it on every P. So can you talk even just more specifically about some of the initiatives that you've been working on that I think you're probably the most proud of, and some of the initiatives that that are still a challenge, and kind of talk about some of those challenges and the dynamics and possibly suggestions of how and if they can ever be overcome?
Well, absolutely. Having worked in local government, I really do see the need for trying to create revenue streams. We in California have a very unique situation with property taxes, and therefore a lot of locals, and I say local jurisdictions, really depend on fees in order to provide the infrastructure or the revenue needed for infrastructure of new housing development. However, we have seen examples, as was already brought up, I believe Mr. Lane brought it up, we have seen examples where some cities have fees that exceed 17% of the development cost. And when you're at that $100,000 mark per door, as was already stated, you're already starting to determine what kind of housing and you're engineering your city or your jurisdiction. And this really comes into effect when you're talking about affordable developers, affordable housing developers. And by the way, I do want to stipulate, I am absolutely 100% supportive of affordable housing. We need affordable housing, but I also believe there needs to be a strong conversation around housing that's affordable. There are those that are that need assistance, that are getting subsidy, that are receiving affordable housing, or that are in need of it, and we need more of it. However, there are those that are making too much to receive subsidy, but not enough to be able to afford home ownership or even rent in some cases. I call that the missing middle. And there has to be a strong conversation around housing that is affordable. Now, when it comes to affordable housing, even we're talking 17%, but even 3 to 5% of cost can make or break, or can break an affordable housing project. So my bill, AB 602, it actually establishes standards for nexus studies that determine these impact fees. And it provides structure, it provides clarity to make sure that these fees are being levied appropriately. I'm not saying the fees shouldn't exist, because we have to have something to make sure that roads and sidewalks and utilities, they're all present, even through special districts. But what I am saying is that there needs to be a study that shows the appropriateness of that fee. And I believe this, I believe that AB 602 is going to significantly lower the cost to build in certain jurisdictions that may not be doing it all right up front. And then when you add in a global pandemic, it's not like that happens every year. When you add the dynamics of what that has done, where people have left a metropolitan area and moved out to the suburbs, we see a different dynamic there that we weren't facing prior. And I think that's going to affect housing as well. I do think, I know I can say this, that in the pandemic, housing costs in San Francisco were actually dropping, but housing costs in Contra Costa County and the suburbs actually rose up to, in some cases, 25% of an increase in housing cost, at least in Contra Costa County. So that's who knows what the trajectory is going to be once we fully open. And I hear we're going to open June 15th. But anyway, who knows what that trajectory is going to be. I am working on some other things. I can highlight those a little later after another question. But one that you talked about, your name keeps coming up and doing some challenging things. Little to know a challenge that I was going to face, and a Pandora's box I was going to open when I introduced AB 1135.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know, and so I get asked questions all the time, and where these build ideas come from, and some are sponsored. There's always this kind of there's so many myths out there, and some do come legitimately from a new idea. But I kind of sometimes feel like there is not a lot of new ideas. This is again has been a crisis. Housing problems have been forever, and folks like you have been in the business forever. But some ideas do come from your head, and some ideas are a menu of options that lobbyists do with. And associations come to you with in January, and you pick and choose. And like I said, I consider you fearless. You've taken on a lot of issues. So because talk a little about some of your big bill ideas. Even some ideas come from audits, and analyses, and things that are other people's idea of dysfunction. And so why don't you tell the folks that may or may not be as familiar with some of the big fearless fights I've seen you in and take on, even if a bill just gets introduced, and some of the reasons why sometimes it's worth just introducing, and some that you are just taking all the way to the end.
Well, I really do purpose. It bothers me that sometimes there may be a colleague or an attempt to do nothing but grab a headline. I don't think that helps anybody, because it creates the opportunity for false narratives. It creates the opportunity for false expectations. And so just to grab a headline, I find I struggle with that ethically. However, you're right. There are sometimes when you introduce the idea and it wasn't for a headline, but it gets attacked or shot down, or it finds a place to lie and go to sleep for a very long time. And then there are other ideas that come, as you stated, through an audit. Now, the fee idea actually came from experience. And standing on one side of that counter and being told that you have to pay a fee for something that is completely unrelated, no nexus whatsoever to the project, was really, really hard to swallow. And so I've been carrying that little burden before I ever came to the assembly, knowing that if I ever made it here, that was one of the issues I was going to address. And I'm glad that we finally have gotten to the point, with the great support of all of you, to be able to push this subject forward. We have taken this from Northern California to Southern California on a statewide tour because we wanted to do it right. And then we also put together a working group. So we spent an entire year on a statewide tour on housing fees. Then we turned on development fees. Then we turned around the next year, which was the COVID year, 2020, put together a working group and had that group. We've already had 5 meetings. We're scheduled for our 6th meeting coming up. And we didn't invite just people that liked the idea. That wasn't going to get us where we needed to go. We actually invited everybody. We wanted to hear both the pros and the cons, the happy people and the not so happy people. And so that was 602. I think what is on the forefront right now came from the auditor, and it was a scathing report from the state auditor that revealed that the state's affordable housing agencies had mismanaged nearly $3 billion. That is not M as in Mary, that is B as in boy, $3 billion that should have gone to building housing. So when I have colleagues talking about we need to come up with another tax, we need to come up, I get it. I'm all for creating revenue streams that are going to help people. What I find frustrating is when we create a revenue stream, we actually bring the revenue in and it never gets to the people that need it the most. And so through the state auditor's report, I was able to partner with the state collector, Betty Yee, and she is the sponsor, and we are working with AB 1135. I think it's great. It's a great piece of legislation because it's similar to what I did with, and I know this is going to be a strange connection here, but it's similar to what I did with my efforts in addressing domestic violence. When you were a victim of domestic violence, you had to go to so many different agencies to get help in so many different ways. So we created the idea of the Family Justice Center, a one-stop shop where that victim walked through the glass doors and everything they needed was under one roof. We're applying that same principle to housing. And instead of going to 4 different state agencies to fill out 4 different applications to address 4 different boards to get one single fund, We're putting that all together under one roof so that we can actually get this money out with one application through one committee. All agencies still have input into this, but it streamlines the process and it gets the money into the hands of the people that need it the most. And it's not just housing, it's about jobs, good union wage jobs, making sure that we have the trades, making sure that we have the crafts involved in quality building, and where people can feel good and safe where they live. So not only creating housing, but creating jobs. But as long as that money is still sitting on the table, no jobs and no housing. And that was a lot. So I can understand why you would want to continue to stay muted. They almost.
Yeah, 1 second, Holly.
Thank you. I'm back. Sorry, I'm unmuted. Sorry, I was not intentionally staying muted, but thank you for giving me my mic back. Well, I have a lobbyist I'm going to give a shout out to, uses this quote about you can't solve peace in the Middle East and cure hunger all in one bill. And sometimes it feels like people ask us and try to do that. And I hope the way you just described it, that what you are taking on a system, and it is tough to get systematic change. But there's even organizations on this call and not on this call that I know are deliberately not taking positions, whether they agree with you and agree with the auditor's report, but it is a political jam that folks are in. And it takes political courage to introduce a bill that you've introduced. And and I'm not sure the answer to this one on where the building trades are on that proposal. I don't know, because so I'm curious, because on some of these big bills and biggest challenges and conflicts that we sometimes see in the Capitol, the labor unions, and not just the building trades, many labor unions, even SEIU and teachers and others get involved in housing conversations that we talk about. Teachers get involved when we talk about student housing and workforce housing, and parents get involved on occasion when we talk about different types of housing. And labor unions do seem like sometimes they're with you, Mr. Grayson, on your bills, and sometimes they're not. And I don't know where they are on this one, but can you talk about, because this continues, I know, to be an issue that continues to come up with many people on this call. I get asked the question all the time, and I wish there was a black or white answer, but there doesn't seem to be. If you could talk a bit about the labor, I hate when people just use one word because there's so many different organizations in the state of California, but kind of give us a little flavor from your perspective. You've worked on so many different initiatives, and I know sometimes they're with you and they're not with you, and sometimes neutral, and why that is, and how you personally navigate through those dynamics.
Well, Holly, that's really a great question, because there are so many dynamics that are in play there. From me personally, I come from a home of labor. My father, Teamster for over 50 years, still a Teamster. My mother involved in labor in our local city, transit. And so I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the wonderful collective and connectivity that comes, collective voice and connectivity that comes with what labor provides. I have an incredible appreciation for unions, for building trades, for crafts, and the great work that they do, in the fact that they are a voice for someone who otherwise would have never had a voice. I do believe there are opportunities where we can achieve the most and reach the greatest potential when we all choose to lay down personal agendas and actually come to the table and discuss first what challenges we are facing, and then how each of us can contribute to the solution of that challenge. And I think sometimes we find ourselves boxed into corners and we build silos when we are solely focused on what we have made our world. And I think all of us would readily admit that the world is a whole lot bigger than just Tim Grayson's perspective or my own knowledge or even my own experience. And I will tell you, in the statewide tour we went on for fees and this working group, I've had the opportunity to learn so much that I didn't know before from special districts or from certain jurisdictions that were small versus the larger ones, that are over a certain size: LA, San Jose, Fresno, Sacramento, and Stockton. So there are always opportunities to learn. I do believe it's a false narrative and a false choice to say you have to choose between trades and affordability, or that you have to choose between environmental sustainability and growth. I believe that when we come together, we're collectively, we become very smart and very creative, and we can make ways. The trades can come together and create ways in which they can contribute to the affordability of housing in California. And one of those ways is, how do we streamline the process without compromising the quality of overview and oversight? And I think that's incredible how they provide apprenticeships, which are state approved, so that we know the person that's putting in the plumbing, that plumbing is going to last and it's going to be there for long term. And we're not selling a bill of goods to a vulnerable group in our community that's going to have to turn around and incur cost because of low quality and workmanship. That's not to say that only unions do quality work. There are many that do quality work, but there is a lot that comes with the certainty of that. Again, I don't want to talk too much. However, it is a land of reality that we have to navigate, that has natural obstacles, natural hills that you have to climb, and valleys you have to traverse. And I have found that collaboration, bringing people to the table, most of the time will get us where we need to go. And there are some times when we do have to agree to disagree, something that I think is an art that we need to get back to.
Unmute, there you go. Now, we've made it through 36 minutes and I haven't heard the word speaker, pro tem, or Southern California or Los Angeles in any names, which is totally your style. And when other folks are asked about dynamics and talking about state, there's other members I've heard even on these calls talk about it. We got an LA problem, an LA delegation problem. We got an issue. And in years past, in my 20 years I've been in the business up here, there's usually been one of the leaders in one house is from the north and the other leader is usually from the south, and that's usually a deal. Now we've got two leaders from the south. But on housing, every policy committee dealing with housing, with the, I guess I could also add in banking and finance. On occasion, some things go through banking and finance, occasion things go through labor, and occasionally through natural resources. But for the most part, every bill related to housing is controlled by a member of the Bay Area caucus. And so housing in the building feels like it's dominated by the Bay Area visions and policies. And I've even heard some Southern California advocates say, oh, we're 2 or 3 years behind the Bay Area, but they can't jam their ideas on us. Is that is that just a perceived and a myth, that that rivalry, or is, and from your, even whether it's housing and other issues, is that north-south rivalry real? And does it impact your ability not just work on housing legislation, but other things, and something that us, even as advocates on the outside, need to consider, because we are meeting with and lobbying and working and advocating and trying to influence folks in the north, south, Central Valley, San Diego, everywhere.
So if that does exist, if there is a rivalry and that tension does exist, I am so happy to announce that I have yet to be caught up in the vortex of that rivalry. And because for me, it's not about who's getting more than the other person. It's about, where is the challenge? What's the problem? And let's all get together and try to figure this out. Now, it may be that there are unique, different problems that exist in LA that may not exist in San Francisco, but vice versa. There are unique issues in San Francisco. So I think getting together and making sure that there's equitable conversations so that it isn't dominated by one caucus or another, listen, we're dealing with a problem in California that cannot be fixed any other way than for all of us, North and South, to come together. California right now has one of the lowest home ownership rates in the nation. It falls almost 10% below the national average. And by the way, the numbers are even worse for Latinx and Black residents at 43% and 35% respectively. So when we're talking about, there's even, if you're wanting to talk about Black home ownership, Black home ownership is lower today than it was in 1960 in the state of California. We've got bigger problems than bickering between who's in North and who's in South, who's in the Valley, who's in the coast. We have got to figure out a way where we create policy that is high enough altitude and flexible enough that the Valley can take that policy and apply it to their issue or their problem uniquely, that LA can take that same policy and carve it and frame it to fit their need, and then the Bay Area can do the same thing. And so that's how I like to approach policy. I like to be prescriptive or microcosm about it, where I'm micromanaging every detail and telling people what they have to do. I don't think being prescriptive in the state of California is the best answer when it comes to housing. I think it's creating policy that allows it, that in which that policy is able to adapt to the environment and the region that it's being applied to.
So it sounds like you're not just brilliant at threading the needle or having a gift, but it sounds like you're also picking your issues are common denominators of common problems. You really avoid that. You called it right, the vortex, and you carry a lot of legislation, and but it doesn't sound like it's not just luck that you're avoiding that vortex, but the policies that you're choosing are allowing that to take place.
You know what, Holly, it's really having conversations, and it's really about relationships, and it's about me spending time with my colleagues from the South to get to hear what they have to say and hear where are they coming from and what they're facing. And I hope that in turn, they're able to hear me and what I'm facing in the Bay Area. And together we can recognize where our common problem is. We create that policy for that, and then allow the flexibility for each of us to take that policy and apply it uniquely to our situation.
And that's a great segue into looking to you for advice. This is a group that's the Housing Action Coalition, partnered with a think tank and a research institution. And I also, I just highlight and want to reiterate to those that are watching that I don't know if I've worked on a bill with you that did not have a study from somewhere, whether it's the Turner Center, SPUR, it's somebody's, you've done it based on, you've got a study or somewhere, something that is always creating that nexus and justification for your bills. You always do that. That's always for certain. But action is how you get things done, is action. A lot of studies sit on shelves, very few make it into pieces of legislation. And this group and everyone on this call is about taking action. So what are some advice that you have for us to get involved and folks in your bills, other bills, and greater? What can we do to be more involved ourselves when we get off this call? I don't want people to, what can they do next? I like to give something a to-do list. When they get off this and get done listening to you, and they all complain about the housing crisis constantly, what can we do to take action and help you get these bills to the governor?
Oh boy, now you really tapped into something personal for me, and that is you got to hurry up and wait. I prayed for patience once. I said, God, I need patience, and I need it right now. And so he put me in the assembly, and so here.
Isn't that the truth?
Here I am, and I have learned the greatest tool to developing really good policy is common sense and data. If you don't have data, you are guaranteed to fault into unintended consequences. Unintended consequences is bad enough as it is, but to not be able to try to mitigate it with data and with conversations and with studies, you're going to do more harm than you are good. So I've had to learn temperance, and I've had to understand, and the comment that someone made to you, Holly, and which you repeated when you said, you can't fix everything in one bill. You absolutely can't. This fee idea that we've been working on, it's been a 4-year project, 4 years. And it started when I first came, and I did a study bill and empowered Turner Center with a budget line request to do a study on fees. Then the next year came back and did the statewide thing. And then the next year did the working group. And now this year, we're actually running the bill. It's taken 4 years to get to this point, and multiple bills. So really what I'm saying is be active, but be strategic in your activity. Have a loud voice, but make sure your loud voice isn't just noise. Make sure your loud voice is backed up with substance and evidence and data, and know the narrative. Don't throw things out and see if it sticks to the wall. And that's what we're going to use, because then people lose respect for everything that didn't stick to the wall. And then they don't listen to what the real narrative should be. So be loud, but be strategic, be purposeful, and get engaged. And what I mean by that is get people to communicate with myself, with offices of the legislature. It is constituents that put me where I am, voters that put me where I am. When I hear from them, I hear from the boss. And so when you want to really impact a legislator, have his or her constituents contact that person, and you'll have their undivided attention. And so I would say get active. When you're trying to reach a particular legislator, make sure that you're going with voices that resonate with that person. Be loud, be strategic, and be patient, and understand it takes time and patience and temperance to get things done.
And I always advise folks to never assume anything with the legislature, because Tim Grayson's bills sometimes get off on unanimous consent, both with bipartisan support. So I've always thought one of the greatest mistakes that some folks make is to assume somebody's an aye, or to assume that they're a yes just based on their voting history. So when it comes to housing, I feel like the most critical mistake people make, and folks make, is assuming that people are going to vote, because it does feel like housing is very local and district oriented. And do you feel, and how even just you came from local government, how folks can get more involved? I know we're talking about state legislation, but how much involvement at the local level, and what I call the farm team, the city council members and board of supervisors all get up here eventually. It doesn't really go the other way very often. But how we can also get involved at the local level to impact cities, and any advice you have for really coming in aggressively and starting to try to change that narrative at the city level as well?
All politics are local. That's where it starts. That is the framework. That's the structure. That's the foundation of it all. And the most productive way to be involved is to come in looking for a solution, looking for an answer, and not attacking, just coming in and attacking bad ideas, or personalizing things and attacking people. I think, especially in non-charter cities, general government cities, where you can not just engage with electeds, but have conversations with the city manager, have conversations with the planning director, and find out, because there are some things that can actually be dealt with outside of the political arena. There's some things that are purely regulatory, and it's actually the electeds that mess it all up when they get involved. So I've told people, I say, I can be a really big help. Sometimes it means sit down and shut up, and I can do that really well. And then there's other times when it is appropriate as an elected to step up. Policy needs to be changed. Something needs to be dealt with from an elected perspective or point of view. So just understand that coming into a city council meeting and going after the jugular of an elected isn't the most productive way. It's really engaging in what is the current framework, what currently exists, where do we want to go, and then what's the best pathway to get there. And when you involve everybody in it, I think most people really want to get to an answer. And those that don't, well, we just have to learn to navigate around those folks.
Well, clearly your political courage comes from your roots, your family, your labor background, your stripes that you earned at the local level, and politics and your and intelligence clearly is why you have the courage to be so committed to taking on some of the toughest challenges I know in my tenure, and so for your tenure. And I'm sure now nobody is surprised watching why you are truly probably the most or unknown champion on housing. Because you're not always in the headlines, but I hope folks realize why you are at the top of my list when I'm looking for a bill offer on something on housing. But Todd, I think we're not opening this up to questions to anybody for obvious reasons of how this started. But I think there has been a few, I think at least private chats and questions at Todd for some follow-up of some things that have come in. So Todd, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Assemblymember. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, actually, so actually, this is my question, Assemblymember Grayson. So I want to say, I really appreciate your collaborative nature, right? That collaboration really seems to be a centerpiece for you. And, as housing advocates, I appreciate your comment of being I need patience and I need it right now. I know that I relate to that feeling, but what I'm wondering, so I heard you use the stat that, right, Black home ownership is the lowest that it's been in California since 1960. That's a phenomenal stat. And I think what I'm wondering is, how do we solve those types of problems simultaneously and be patient, right? There's a certain sense of urgency that I do think needs to come with this. And when I think about the Southern California, so, right, we are an organization, SPUR, Michael will say if I'm speaking right, but we advocate, right, for urban infill housing, right? We need more units of housing near, in urban centers, near transit centers, near job centers, right? There's this very strong environmental component. And we're saying that, California's experiencing this affordability and displacement crisis because we just haven't built enough housing over the last 30 years. And that, quite frankly, that is not the point of view that many in the Los Angeles delegation have. They would not necessarily agree with that is the problem, and that the solution to that is to build more housing in urban places in Southern California. So I'm just curious, how do you rectify those two things? We need to be patient, but we also need to have a sense of urgency. And I want to be collaborative, but the solutions that I see maybe aren't what some of my colleagues see. And I'm just wondering, how do we all kind of get there together? Sorry, that was a long question.
That's a long question, but it's a fantastic question, Todd. I really appreciate that, because you're giving me the opportunity now to go where my passion burns even stronger. And that is this: for those folks that are struggling with the housing conversation and feeling the urgency of it, like we're feeling, like we see and witness, we also have to understand what their conversation is and where they're seeing things from. And so for me, I have found success in the fact that when I talk about housing, it cannot be siloed. It can't be strictly within the parameters of sticks coming out of the ground and putting a roof over someone's head with a front door. It may be that while I'm talking about housing and affordable housing for homeless, I've also got to talk about wraparound services. If I'm talking about infill housing, then I've got to talk about affordable housing that is within proximity to mass transit and jobs, transit-oriented development, because we all know that underserved communities, one of the struggles they have is the commute and being able to afford to get to a job where they can make money or have the means to get to a job. So when we break down the silos and we're talking about housing to someone who may be of a Southern delegation who doesn't see it the way I see it in urgency, then we talk about education. We talk about job opportunities and equality and equity. We talk about healthcare. we talk about wraparound services. And when you break down those things out of their silos, then you start talking about not just housing development, but you start talking about smart housing development. I have a perfect example here in my district. I served on Concord's council as well, and had to deal with this. It's still going on, but it's the development of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. And it would not be prudent to develop that 5,000 acres with 12,500 homes without considering the fact that we also should include a 4-year higher education institution, that we should also include 6 million square feet of commercial space, not counting light industry, that we should also include parks and a sports center. And the reason why is because we have got to not just build housing, but build communities where people can live, work, and play all in the same area, where we're saving the environment by decreasing our commutes. In the Bay Area, pre-pandemic, it was a 2-hour commute from Antioch to San Francisco one way. That is impacting people's quality of life. So when people don't want to talk about strictly housing, then I begin to engage them on, well, let's talk about education and how education impacts housing. Or let's talk about healthcare or jobs and job centers and transit centers and how it impacts housing or how housing can impact it. So I feel where you're at, I definitely have the urgency and the passion for housing, but I think it would be best if we break down silos and have conversations about other things that should accompany the conversation of housing.
Well, the governor shared your passion too before he became governor and before the pandemic. And I'm curious what you think it would take to get a declaration of emergency when it comes to the communities that you're just describing and building construction of not just housing, but everything. But how do we get from either crisis to emergency? Because my fear is that the crisis is evolving into a state of being because of patience not being a virtue in this case, to Todd's point, and everyone sharing your passion and urgency. So I hope with this, trying to get others and what we can try to do to get more members, more electeds, local, and the governor as well, to have that courage and that passion to do more. Because there is the sense of we don't have this emergency we had for executive orders during the pandemic as we needed pre and now post pandemic for housing construction.
Holly, great point. And I agree with you. There needs to be a declaration of emergency. However, given the dynamics the governor's going through right now, I'm not sure. And I wouldn't want to be in his shoes by any stretch of the imagination. However, we are dealing with a global pandemic that literally is changing things on a daily basis. We are now seeing a completely different workforce that's working from home, and who knows what we're going to actually return to once we get past this. So again, that doesn't, and by the way, if I may clarify, patience doesn't mean is not synonymous with not doing anything. Patience just simply means move forward systematically, move forward strategically, move forward understanding that when you plant that seed, it has its own time. It will bring forth fruit if you continue to work. And one of the words that we think of when we think of patience is wait. But waiting doesn't mean sitting there and doing nothing. Waiting means serving, and serving productively.
What a great way to end.
So, Assemblymember Grayson, one of the questions that we like to end most of our conversations with is, tell us, what are you excited about? Like, what are you hopeful about that you see for California's future?
I'm excited about the fact that there's so much how can I word this? I'm excited about the fact that there is so much opportunity to improve. There is so much happening right now that is, the needle is pushing on crisis. The needle is pushing emergency. And we have ample opportunity, every one of us, to get engaged, to offer our talents, to offer our intellect and what we have. We all have an opportunity to become a part of a solution in our local area, in our neighborhood, even in our own home. And on a state level, all of us legislators have got to come to we have to awaken ourselves and look at all the opportunities we have right in front of us right now to get some serious work done and get it done expeditiously. So I'm excited about the opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for that. It was great spending an hour with you, with a little bit of halftime entertainment, done at the beginning of the before halftime. But anyway, Holly and Michael, Lighthouse and SPUR, thank you so much for partnering with us on this. It's always a pleasure. And please, everyone, remember to join the Housing Action Coalition for our 15th annual Spring Symposium on May 26th. Hope everyone has a great